Chairman, Joint Chief of Staff, Instruction, Standard Rules, Engagement, Standard Rules for U.S. Force of U.S. Forces. Alright, enclosure L, Standing Rules for Use of Force of U.S. Forces. Purpose. Standing Rules of Use of Force provide operational guidance, establish fundamental policy, procedure for the governing action of the Department of Defense performing civil support missions, military assistance, civil authorities, military support, civilian law enforcement agencies, routines for the function, including anti-terrorism and FP4 duties of the U.S. territories, include U.S. territorial waters. These standard rules of use of force apply to land, homeland defense missions occurring within the U.S. territory of the Department of Defense Force, civilian contractors performing law enforcement aid and security detail of all the DoD installations and all the installation while conducting DoD security functions within, outside the U.S. territories unless overrides directive of Secretary of Defense of the nation along with an international agreement that may limit the U.S. force means accomplishing their law enforcement security duties. Additional examples of these missions U.S. include the protection of critical U.S. infrastructure both on and off DoD installations, military assistance support of the civil authorities, Department of Defense support during civil disturbance for the DoD, cooperation federal, state, and local law enforcement authorities, including counter-drug support, standard rules of use of force cancels, Joint Chief of Staff Index 312102, rules of force of the DoD personnel providing support of law enforcement agents conducting counter-drug operations of the United States, rules of use of force contained with the Department of Defense Civil Disturbance Plan, Guard and Plot existing standing military department and combat commander rules, use of force directives shall be reviewed, update, comply with these standard rules of force. Existing Secretary of Defense approved missions, specifically rules of force remaining in effect, unless otherwise noted. The use of force guidelines contained in this instruction supersedes contained with the Department of Defense Directive 5210-56, Enclosure 2. Unit commanders at all levels must teach and train their personnel how to well use both non-deadly and deadly force in self-defense. DoD forces detail the use of the U.S. government lead federal agencies will operate under the common mission for rules of use of force approved of the Secretary of Defense and the LFA. Lead federal agencies, Department of Defense Force, always use the right of self-defense with the standard rules of use of force. Department of Defense for use of U.S. Coast Guard control conducting operations both outside within territorial limits of the U.S. filed with the use of the foreign policy warning shots, disabling fire as issued with the commandment of the U.S. Coast Guard Pro 14, Title U.S. Standard Code 637. Reference WDOD force under the U.S. Coast Guard control inside of the territorial limit of the U.S. retain the right to self-defense over the standard rules of use of force. Department of Defense force for the Department of Defense controls and using the Department of Defense standard rules of use of force missions, standard rules of force, operating, coordinating with other lead federal agency security forces, coordinate with lead federal agency personnel to ensure the common understanding of the Department of Defense rules of use of force. Combat commanders shall not notify Secretary of Defense through the Chairman, Joint Chief of Staff any use of force issue that cannot be resolved. Policy: unit commanders always retain an inherent right to obligation to exercise the unit self-defense and response with a hostile act with a demonstrated hostile intent. Unit self-defense indicate that the defense of the other DoD force in vicinity. Combat commander mission over the rules and use of force. Combat commanders may augment these standard rules of use of force necessary to submit request of the mission. Specific rules of force: the Chairman, Chief of Staff, Secretary of Defense approval. Message format requesting approval of the mission. Specific rules of force may contain in enclosure P. Unit commanders may further restrict missions. Specific rules of force approved by the Secretary of Defense uses. Commanders shall notify the Secretary of Defense through the Chairman, Joint Chief of Staff as practical with the restrictions at all levels placed on Secretary of Defense approved rules of force in time critical situation, making Secretary of Defense notification concurrently with the Chairman, Joint Chief of Staff. When concurrent notification is not possible, notify the Chairman, Joint Chief of Staff as practical after the Secretary of Defense notification. Combat commanders will distribute the standard rules of force to subordinate commanders in units of implementation, definitions of authority, inherent right over the self-defense. Unit commanders always retain the inherent right and obligation to exercise unit self-defense and respond with a hostile act, demonstrated hostile intent, unless otherwise directed. Unit commander detailed below, the service members may exercise the individual self-defense in response to a hostile act, demonstrated with a hostile intent, with the individuals assigned with and acting as part of the unit. Individual self-defense should be considered the subset of the unit self-defense. As such, unit commanders may limit the individual self-defense by a member of the units. Imminent threat with the determination of whether the danger of the death or serious bodily harm is imminent. It will be based on assessment of all of the facts circumstances with all the known to the DoD forces at the time when it may be made at any level. Imminent danger does not necessarily mean immediate, instantaneous. Individual with the capability to inflict the death or serious bodily harm who would demonstrate intent to do so may consider it an imminent threat. Hostile act, an act or other use of force against the United States U.S. forces, designated person or property also includes the force directly precluded to impede the mission and or duties U.S. forces, including recovery U.S. personnel vital to U.S. government property. Hostile intent, imminent threat of the U.S. force against the United States, U.S., and with the designated person or property also includes the threat of force precluded with the impede with the mission of the duties of the U.S. force, including with the recovery of the personnel vital U.S. Coast Guard property, assets vital to security for the purpose of the Department of Defense operation with the defined president designated with a non-DOD with a DOD property, actual threat of the sabotage within the president determines seriously jeopardize fulfillment of the national defense mission to create an imminent threat of the danger of serious bodily harm. Example that include but not limited to nuclear weapon, nuclear command control facilities, designated restricted areas contain strategic operation assets, sensitive codes, and special asset programs, identifying dangerous property, personal property considered with inherent with a danger for the hands of the unauthorized individual will create with an imminent threat of the death and serious bodily harm. Examples may include but are not limited to portable missiles, rocket arms, ammunition, explosives, chemical agents, special nuclear materials unseen. DoD commanders authorized to classify properties of inherent danger. National critical infrastructure purpose of the Department of Defense operating presidential designated public utilities, similar critical infrastructure with the public health and safety damage of which the president determines which will create an imminent threat of the death or serious bodily harm. Procedure de-escalation when time circumstance permit with a threatening force should be warned and given an opportunity with a withdrawal and cease threatening action. Use of non-deadly force. Natural force to be used on the last resort. Normally the force is to be used only as a last resort. Force should be the minimum necessary with the use of force and the reasonable of the intensity of the duration magnitude based on the totality of circumstance countered with the threat. If the force is required, the non-deadly force is authorized, maybe even the control of the situation accomplished with the mission, provides self-defense force of the defense of the non-defense person in the vicinity of the directly related to the assigned mission of the defense of the protected property. When doing so with a reasonable under the circumstance, use of the services approved of the unit issued and non-lethal weapons, right control agents, and including Orlean, capsium, paper spray, CS gas, authorized operations other than war, detailed guidance for the riot control agents of the DoD personnel with governed by the Chairman Joint Chief of Staff 311007 series, reference B and T listed in enclosure K. When operating under standard rules of use of force, warning shots are not authorized U.S. territory, including U.S. territory waters, except when the appropriate exercise of the force protection U.S. naval service vessels with limited set in enclosure M. Using deadly force. Deadly force is to be used only when all means lesser means have been available that cannot reasonably be employed. Deadly force is authorized under the following circumstances. Inherent right of self-defense. Deadly force is authorized. DoD unit commanders responsible to leave with a person posed for the imminent threat of the death or serious bodily harm to the DoD force or unit self-defense, including with the defense of the DoD force in vicinity. Defense of the authority. The deadly force authorized design with a non-dead DoD person in vicinity directly related to the assigned mission, the assets vital national security. Deadly force is of the deadly force reasonable appear with the necessary to prevent with the actual threat of the sabotage asset vital with the national security. Here, dangerous property of the deadly force authorized deadly force responsible appear with the necessary to prevent with the actual threat of the sabotage and here with the dangerous property of the national critical infrastructure of the deadly force is authorized deadly force reasonable appear with the necessary to prevent with the sabotage of the national critical infrastructure. Additional within directly related to the assigned mission. Deadly force authorized following circumstances, series of offenses against person. Deadly force authorized deadly force reasonably appear with the necessary to prevent with the commission of a serious offense with the involved with the imminent with the threat of the dangerous serious bodily harm. For example, setting fire with the inhabited dwelling, snipping including in the defense of the other person whom the deadly force is directed again with the pursuing, threatening with the committed with the offense. Example, including murder, armed robbery, and aggravated assault. Escape of the deadly force is authorized with when the deadly force responsible appears necessary to prevent escape of the person provided with the probable cause to believe that such person or have committed with the attempted committed serious offense that is one involved with the imminent threat of the death and serious bodily harm that would pose with the imminent threat of death and serious bodily harm to the DoD forces other in the vicinity. Arrest and apprehension of the deadly force is authorized when the deadly force is reasonable and appears necessary to arrest and apprehend a person who is whenever there is probable cause to believe has committed a serious offense indicated in subparagraph C above. Enclosure M, maritime operation within U.S. territory. Purpose scope of enclosure governs the action to be taken in the U.S. for conducting maritime contingency mission with the military assistance, civil authorities, routine services function, anti-terrorism, foreign power duties under the Department of Defense control of U.S. territorial waters unless otherwise directed to Secretary of Defense. The Department of Defense under the U.S. Coast Guard control conduct operations both outside of the territorial limits of the U.S. without the use of the foreign policy warning shot with a disabling fire issued with the commandment U.S. Coast Guard per 114 United States Code 637 reference W with the DoD force with the U.S. Coast Guard control and some of the territorial limited U.S. retaining the right of self-defense and with the standard rules of use of force. U.S. Coast Guard unit conducting U.S. Coast Guard law enforcement missions involving operating with the Department of the Navy following U.S. Coast Guard use of force policy contained with the U.S. Coast Guard maritime law enforcement and annual common command instructions M1624/7.1B. U.S. Coast Guard unit operating at DoD Force Tactical Command will have the territorial limit of the United States not conducting U.S. Coast Guard law enforcement missions with operating under the standard rules of use of force, policy and definitions of authority and procedures. Threat indicators unit commanders use the best of judgment based on available information, including intelligence, political, military factors, technological capability, determining the intent of the threatening force. Sample actions might lead to reasonable belief the imminent threat exists. Warning shots to the U.S. Navy, the Navy surface vessel. The warning shots protect the U.S. Navy, the naval surface vessel within the territorial sea with the internal waters of the United States are over the authorized when an appropriate extra of the force production. U.S. Navy, the naval surface vessels, they are fired over water to warn approaching vessel when clear of line of fire exists, when crew served up a weapon or rifle, personnel certified with the training program approved service of chief under tactical direction, competent authority of the determined service chief, when there is no other means reasonable available to determine the intent of the approaching craft without increasing the threat of the U.S. Navy, the Navy surface vessels and personnel. Maritime law enforcement, post-security operations, U.S. Coast Guard, and lead federal agencies conducting maritime law enforcement operations high sea with the waters subject to the U.S. jurisdiction. U.S. Coast Guard control will follow the use of force policy with the commandment. U.S. Coast Guard maritime interception operation and within the U.S. territorial waters conducted with the standard rules of engagement. Any additional mission ready rules of engagement provided Secretary of Defense approves orders. Alright, Appendix N, land contingency security related to operations of the U.S. territory per purpose and scope of the enclosure governed the act of the taking of the U.S. force for conducting land contingency missions of the military assistance of the civil authorities, military support with civilian law enforcement agencies, routine service functions, including AT and FP duty for the U.S. territory except for in conducting counter-drug operations, with the exposure O and enclosure O, with the enclosure applied with the land home defense with the issue of the concurrent with the U.S. territory DoD forces civilian and contractor conducting law enforcement and security duty for the DoD installation and office installation while conducting DoD security functions within U.S. territories unless otherwise directed to the Secretary of Defense. Policy definitions attributed in procedures, temporary detention of the threatening of the personnel of the DoD with a temporary detained individuals who gain authorized access to perimeters other than secure the established pursuant to the assigned DoD missions, refuse to depart established perimeter or secured after any being denied access unless otherwise threatening the safety and security of the Department of Defense or the other non-DoD personnel of the vicinity where the defense is directly related to the assigned mission with the properly secured with the DoD forces. Detained person and any of their property that was secured with the relief of the custody of the civilian law enforcement authority with the earliest opportunity consistent with the mission accomplishment. Detain an individual with the vehicles, any of the property control of the search of the force protection measure in order to ensure the safety and security of the DoD force over the non-DoD personnel in the vicinity. Security inspections, individual property authorized grant entry with the Department of Defense established perimeter secured area upon existing established perimeter of secured area. Vehicular threats, weapons may be fired at moving the vehicles, watercraft with the Department of Defense reasonable belief that the vehicle and watercraft imminent threat with a dangerous serious bodily harm to the DoD force. Weapons may also be fired at moving the vehicle, watercraft posing imminent threat with a death of a series of bodily harm to non-DoD personnel in the vicinity where doing is directly related to the assigned mission. Pursuit with its own property if assets vital with the national security, asset considered inherently dangerous to others, are stolen. Civil law enforcement personnel security force if not reasonably available to recover the combat commander when they authorize the DoD forces to pursue and recover assets provided in pursuit is immediate with continue with uninterrupted. The combat commander may delegate the authority as required. The DoD forces will contact civilian law enforcement authorities as soon as practicable to inform them of the threat of their pursuit. Support law enforcement agencies and military assistance civilian disturbance and similar incidences. Show off the force, including use of the riot control information, use riot control agents, detailed guidance based on the riot control agents defined in Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff 311007 series, nuclear, biological, chemical defense, riot control agents, and herbicides, use of other non-lethal weapons, confrontation of civilians. DoD forces will attempt to avoid confrontation with individuals pose no threat to the unit. Other non-DoD personnel vicinity of the person secured with the DoD forces. Confrontation period likely DoD forces shall include their self-defense readiness posture to notify appropriate civilian law enforcement agent, enforcement authorities, security agents, and personnel as soon as practical fees and carry for the danger of the DoD force of the non-DoD personnel in the vicinity or a warning to see if threatening action should be given in the use of force. Safety innocent bystander. DoD will show the duty with regard to safety innocent bystanders using force. Hard Appendix O, counter-drug support operations within the U.S. territory. Purpose of the enclosure supplements guidance provided with the enclosure L of the U.S. force for the counter-drug operation with the DoD control U.S. territories unless otherwise directed with Secretary of Defense. The document replaces Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff 31-21-02-31, May 20th. Department of Defense units, U.S. Coast Guard conducting operation both outside of the territorial limit of the U.S. file with the use of the foreign policy warning shot of disabling fire issued with the commandment U.S. Coast Guard per 14 U.S. Coast Guard 637. Reference WU's naval units, personal operating U.S. Coast Guard control inside with the territorial limit of the U.S. retain self-defense and the standard rules of use of force, definitions and authorities, and supplemented in the following: accompanying physically to be or go with the Department of Defense or corporate accompanying the U.S. law enforcement agencies on counter-drug related deployments for the travel of the personnel on foot or in the same vehicle, aircraft, or ship, boat. Actual counter-drug field operation activity during which the intent with a reasonable expectation is the use of U.S. law enforcement agencies and counter-drug related deployments will conduct counter-drug law enforcement functions. Law enforcement functions activities include but not limited to search, seizures, and arrests and other similar activities. Procedures and supplemented the following: Department of Defense will not accompany law enforcement agencies' actual counter-drug operation, particularly with any counter-drug activity related to imminent threats of the unusually authorized by the Secretary of Defense. Except to describe that the DoD forces may not accompany U.S. law enforcement agents, provide counter-drug support with a location outside of the designated of the base for the operation. Limitation not intended to prevent with the DoD force with the accompanying use of the U.S. law enforcement agency with an authorized transportation or aerial reconnaissance, air detection, monitoring support mission, unauthorized support mission of the base operation to another. DoD forces may pursue the forward operating support base or area only after the commander or other officials designated with a reasonable combat commander makes a determination that such base or area is secure and adequately protected. Limitations described above are not meant to prevent the DoD forces from conducting authorized extraction during the designated with the drug interdiction areas, and events where the appropriate measures will be taken to ensure that the DoD forces will not be in a location where the involvement related to imminent threat exists. DoD forces will make every attempt to avoid confrontation with non-mission personnel or civilians. Forces will only use its self-defense unless otherwise directed by the Secretary of Defense. In addition, Secretary of Defense guidelines from the enclosure of the general guidelines apply. Use of force and self-defense. Right of use of force and self-defense may not be used to justify substitution. DoD force for the U.S. law enforcement personnel augmented the offense's use of force by laws enforcement personnel with counter-drug operations intended to apprehend drug traffickers. Alright, enclosure P. Rules of use of force message. Rules of use of force request message format. Request mission rules of use of force will vary greatly depending on the task mission incorporated with the language consistent with the Secretary of Defense guidance as a result of the lesson of the learning or the joint staff of the combat commander. Rules of engagement. Rules of use of force for the deemed effective. Each request for the mission rules of force identified with the operating plan with which participants assume the request of the rules of the use of force necessary to accomplish a particular course of action outlined with the message are as follows. Mission overview includes the commanding relationship force supporting specific measures requested request to authorize supplemental numbering scheme and is required rules use of force at the time could use both of deadly and non-deadly force requests where applicable. Paragraph 4 can cancel measure. Paragraph 5, previous measure remaining in force. And paragraph 6, remarks. Enclosure Q is rules of use of force references. And that completes the standard rules of use of engagement of the U.S. forces.